The dog hit the wall so hard the drywall cracked. Three handlers were already bleeding. A fourth had dropped his catchpole and backed into a corner, arms up, voice shaking. The animal, 110 pounds of Belgian Malinois muscle, stood in the center of the intake bay at Callaway Military Animal Medical Center, chest heaving, eyes wild, lips pulled back over teeth that had already done serious damage tonight. Everyone in that hallway agreed this dog was going to kill someone before morning. Then the door at the far end opened, and a woman in pale green scrubs walked in alone. No pole, no muzzle, no backup. She sat down on the concrete floor 12 feet from the animal and waited. The dog stopped snarling. If this story already has you holding your breath, subscribe to this channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because nothing about that night was an accident. The call came in at 11:47 p.m., which meant Nora Vass was already on hour 14 of a shift that was supposed to end at 8. She was in the back supply room inventorying suture kits when her pager went off. Not the standard triage code, but the red line alert that meant incoming critical military designation, handle with extreme caution. She read the secondary line twice because she thought she'd misread it the first time. SEAL attached K9. Handler reports aggressive incident. Multiple personnel injuries en route. Clearance required for intake. Nora tucked the pager back into her scrub pocket and finished counting the suture kits. She got to 42, marked it on the clipboard, then walked out to the intake bay. Callaway Military Animal Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Teller, Idaho. Not a large city, not a famous one, but home to 3 military installations and a contractor corridor that had been expanding steadily for the better part of a decade. The facility handled everything from routine care for service dogs to full surgical trauma response, and it operated under a hybrid structure, part military, part civilian, with a staff mix that sometimes worked smoothly and sometimes didn't. Tonight it wasn't working smoothly. The duty supervisor, Dr. Garrett Osh, was already in the bay when Nora arrived, standing with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing it did when he was calculating how much liability was walking through the door. Beside him was the facility's head behaviorist, Marcus Tully, 50s, thick gray mustache, a man who had been at Callaway for 11 years and never once, in Nora's experience, admitted uncertainty about anything. "Vass," Osh said when he saw her, "you're not on the response roster tonight." "I was in supply, heard the alert." She looked at the intake door. "What's the situation?" "Unstable military working dog, SEAL unit out of a forwards training program. Handler says the animal has been escalating for 2 weeks. Tonight he attacked 2 contractors and a junior handler." Osh paused. 3 lacerations, 1 possible fracture in the junior's hand. "How old is the dog?" Tully answered before Osh could. 4 years. Malinois, full combat certification, highest level of operational clearance. Which means this animal has been through more screening and behavioral evaluation than half the people in this building. He said it like it settled something. "The concern isn't his training. The concern is what he's become." Nora looked at him. "What's his name?" "That's not really relevant right now." "It's relevant to me." Tully's jaw tightened slightly. "The file lists him as Coda." She nodded once and stepped back toward the wall as the outside doors opened and the transport unit came in. There were 4 of them, 2 military handlers in full gear, a civilian from whatever contractor had arranged transport, and the man walking at the front of the group who didn't look like he needed the other 3. Commander Ren Harwick was not a large man by height, maybe 6 foot even, but the way he moved through a space made it feel smaller. Late 30s, dark haircut, regulation short, a face that had clearly spent serious time in difficult weather. He wore civilian clothes, cargo pants, a gray thermal, boots that had seen a lot of use, but he moved with the posture of someone who had spent so long in uniform that it lived in his spine now. He was holding a short lead attached to a tactical harness. The dog at the end of it was not calm. Coda was moving in tight, agitated circles around Harwick's feet, head low, ears pinned back. Every few steps he'd stop and look behind him, then resume the circling. His breathing was audible from across the bay. The muscles along his back and shoulders were locked tight, and when the overhead fluorescent light flickered, just once, just briefly, the dog flinched so hard he nearly pulled the lead from Harwick's grip. Commander Harwick, Osh said, stepping forward. I'm Dr. Osh. I'll be overseeing tonight's assessment. If you can get the animal secured in the evaluation room. I've been trying to get him secured for the last hour, Harwick said. His voice was flat and clipped. He won't tolerate the crate. He won't tolerate the muzzle. He's already put 3 people down tonight, and I need your staff to understand that before anyone approaches him. He looked around the bay. I want your most experienced handler. Military background if possible. No rookies, no one who's going to panic. Tully stepped forward. I'll take the evaluation myself. I've handled Tier 1 working dogs before, Commander. I know what... The door to the side corridor opened. Coda exploded. Not toward Tully. Toward the door. Toward the noise. Toward whatever his brain had decided was a threat in the half-second between the latch clicking and the door swinging wide. He hit the end of the lead so hard that Harwick actually moved 2 steps forward, boots scraping concrete, before he planted and hauled back. The dog went up on his hind legs, straining, full-throated sound tearing out of him. Not a bark, something lower and more desperate, a sound that didn't quite have a clean category. One of the handlers behind Harwick reached for a catchpole. Don't, Nora said. Everyone looked at her. She was standing near the wall where she'd been since the group came in, clipboard still in her hand, watching the dog. If you use the pole, he's going to associate restraint with whatever just terrified him, and the response will get worse, not better, she said. Her voice was calm in a way that wasn't performed. It was just even. He needs the stimulus to stop before anyone tries to move him. Harwick stared at her. Who are you? Nora Vass, trauma nursing, overnight shift. She set the clipboard down on a supply cart. What just happened when that door opened? Was that a noise reaction or a light reaction? Both, Harwick said after a pause. Has that been consistent? Both triggers together, or sometimes independent? Something moved through his expression. Not quite surprise, but close. Mostly together. Occasionally noise alone. Nora nodded and crouched down against the wall, making herself lower and smaller, removing herself from the geometry of the room as a standing threat. Coda had stopped straining at the lead but was still breathing in hard, fast pulls, body rigid, gaze jumping around the room. Give him 60 seconds, she said quietly. Don't talk. Don't move toward him. Just wait. Tully made a sound. Vass, this isn't your intake. Marcus. Osh said his name in a tone that stopped the sentence. He was watching Coda. The dog's breathing was slowing. Not all the way, not anything close to calm, but the frantic chest heaving was easing into something more measured. His gaze stopped jumping and settled, briefly, on Nora's position against the wall. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She was just there, low and still, the way you'd sit at the edge of a field and let something come to you instead of going to it. 40 seconds in, Coda sat down. It wasn't full submission. His body was still tense, the muscles still loaded. But he sat, and the sound stopped, and the room felt like everyone in it had exhaled without realizing they'd been holding their breath. Harwick looked at Nora for a long moment. What did you just do? Nothing, she said. I waited. She stood slowly and retrieved her clipboard. He needs a quiet room, no overhead fluorescence, and about 30 minutes before any hands-on assessment. I'd also want to look at his harness rigging. He flinched when you took tension on the lead, and that's not typical of a dog this certification level. That's a pain response. Tully crossed his arms. I'll determine the evaluation protocol, Commander. We have procedures here for a reason. Harwick looked from Tully to Nora and back. He had the expression of a man running rapid calculations. Fine, he said finally. Show me the quiet room. They didn't give her the case. That became clear within the next 20 minutes. Tully took lead on the evaluation, Harwick stayed in the room with Coda, and Nora was handed 2 other overnights. A standard post-surgical check on a retired detection dog and a nutrition adjustment for a Belgian Shepherd recovering from a leg fracture. She did both without comment and spent the next hour and a half on regular rounds, checking in on the 6 other animals in the overnight ward. She also, because the ward shared a ventilation wall with the secondary evaluation suite, could hear portions of what was happening in there. What she heard was not going well. Tully's approach with high-drive working dogs was structured around established behavioral hierarchy, entry protocols, graduated exposure, controlled reward systems. It was a legitimate methodology. It worked on a lot of dogs. But what Nora was hearing through the wall was a dog that wasn't responding to any of it, cycling through distress patterns that should have been settling but weren't, and a man, Harwick, who was getting quieter in a way that didn't mean calmer. His voice had dropped to a register she associated with people who were absorbing bad news and deciding what to do with it. At one point, she heard him say, "He wasn't like this 6 weeks ago." She heard Tully respond, "Behavioral deterioration in working dogs under high-stress operational deployment is not uncommon, Commander. The data suggests—" "I'm not asking about data. I'm asking what's wrong with my dog." Silence. Nora finished her rounds, updated 3 charts, and went to the break room to get coffee she wasn't going to sleep through anyway. Priya Holt was in there, second-year veterinary tech, sharp enough, still in the phase of her career where she calibrated her opinions by watching what the senior staff believed. She looked up from her phone when Nora came in. "How bad is it?" Priya asked. "The dog?" Nora poured coffee. "He's in a lot of distress. Tully's going to recommend sedation and a full behavioral workup over multiple days. I heard him telling Osh." Priya set her phone down. "The commander doesn't want that. He wants the dog cleared for return to the unit." "What does the dog want?" Priya blinked. "What?" "Never mind." Nora drank her coffee. It was bad coffee. The overnight pot always was. But it was hot. "Has anyone looked at his equipment? The tactical harness?" "That's not really our department. The gear comes in with the handler, it goes out with the handler." The dog showed a pain response when tension was applied to the lead. If there's something wrong with how the harness is fitted, or if the rigging has been modified in some way, that changes the behavioral picture entirely. Nora set her cup down. A dog that's been experiencing intermittent pain stimulus from his own equipment would show exactly the kind of erratic, trigger-sensitive response pattern Coda has been showing. Priya looked at her for a moment. "How do you know about pain stimulus behavioral mapping in working dogs?" "I read." That's a pretty specific thing to just know from reading." Nora looked at the clock on the wall. It was 20 past 1 in the morning. "I'm going to go finish my charts," she said. She was at the nurse's station when the alarm went off. Not the fire alarm, not the medical alert, the containment alarm, which was a different tone entirely, a sharp 2-pulse sequence that meant an animal was loose or a situation in a room had gone critical. It came from the secondary evaluation suite. Nora was moving before the second pulse finished. She came through the corridor door to find one of the military handlers pressed against the far wall, a red line of blood across his forearm, and Tully backed into the corner near the equipment cabinet with his hands up at shoulder height. Harwick was in the center of the room, lead dropped, trying to talk Coda down, and Coda was not listening. The dog had gone to a place past reasoning. Whatever Tully's graduated exposure protocol had been building toward, it had ended here. The dog had hit a threshold and crossed it, and now he was operating on pure survival circuitry, moving around the room in a low, fast pattern that kept everyone in his visual field at once. "We need the catch poles," Tully said from his corner. His voice was careful and controlled. "Nora, go get—" "No poles," she said. "Vas, Marcus, a catch pole right now will trigger a full attack response. He is not in a space where restraint reads as safe. It reads as threat." She stepped into the room fully, cleared the door, and closed it behind her. "Everyone stay where you are. Don't move." Harwick looked at her over his shoulder. His jaw was tight, and there was something in his eyes that was close to desperate. A man who was watching a situation slide somewhere he couldn't pull it back from. "He's going to go for someone," he said quietly. "He's been cycling like this for 4 minutes. He's going to make contact." "I know." She moved to the center of the room, not fast, not slow, measured. The way you walked into a space you were claiming without making it a challenge. She lowered herself to the floor, sitting cross-legged, and positioned herself at roughly the room's center, equidistant from the walls and the people pressed against them. Coda tracked her immediately. He stopped his circuit. His head swung toward her, ears up for the first time since he'd come in. Attention, not aggression. The lip was still raised, showing teeth, but the vocalization had gone quiet. "He's going to bite you," Tully said. She didn't answer him. Coda was looking at her with the concentrated, processing look of an animal trying to categorize something. She wasn't approaching. She wasn't retreating. She wasn't holding anything, wasn't attached to anything. She was just sitting on the floor of his room, and that was a category he didn't have a file for. He took one step toward her. Tully inhaled sharply. The dog took another step, paused, then a third. He stopped about 4 feet from her, head low now, ears in a complex middle position. Not submissive, not aggressive, something provisional. She held eye contact for a 2-second interval, then let her gaze drop slightly, taking the edge off. Not breaking, just softening. The dog sat down. 3 seconds later, he stood back up, crossed the remaining 4 feet, and put his nose against her knee. The room went so quiet she could hear the ventilation system. Nora kept her hand still, let him investigate, and after about 15 seconds raised one hand in a slow arc and placed it on the side of his neck. Not gripping, just resting. She could feel the tension in the muscles under her palm, the way his whole body was still braced for something. But the worst of it was gone. He was breathing. He was present. "Good boy," she said quietly. "You're all right." Harwick crouched down to the dog's level when it was clear the moment had held. He moved slowly, gave Coda time to register him, and the dog, still shaking slightly, muscles still loaded, turned and pressed his shoulder against the commander's thigh. It wasn't the greeting of a working dog to a handler. It was the gesture of something exhausted, asking to be done with whatever this was. Harwick looked at his dog for a long moment. Then he looked at Nora. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you saw." Tully had straightened from his corner. His arms were crossed again. "Commander, I need to clarify that our established evaluation protocol was in progress, and this intervention, I'm not talking to you right now." Harwick's voice didn't change in volume. It just landed differently. He was still looking at Nora. "Talk." She kept one hand resting lightly on Coda's side. He didn't go critical because of the evaluation. He went critical because of the E-stim collar that's threaded through the base of his tactical harness. The room shifted. "I noticed it during intake when you walked in," Nora continued. "It's a stimulation device. Looks like part of the harness rigging. Fits against the underside of the neck at the junction point with the chest plate. It's designed to look like a connector clip." She looked at Harwick. "Someone has been running current through that device intermittently. I don't know how long, but every time something scared him tonight, the door, the overhead light, the transition to the evaluation room, there was a corresponding physical flinch that wasn't tracking with the stimulus alone. It was tracking with additional pain." Complete silence. Harwick's hand had stopped moving on Coda's back. His expression had gone very still. The specific stillness of someone who has just been told something that rearranges a significant portion of their recent past. "That's a serious accusation," Tully said. "The harness was certified and inspected before this unit." "I'm not making an accusation," Nora said. "I'm telling you what I observed. The device is there. You can see it yourself if you look at the harness under light." She paused. "I'd recommend removing it before any further behavioral assessment, and I'd recommend that nobody handle that device without gloves, because whatever's on it isn't mine to document." Harwick stood up slowly. He reached down and unclipped Coda's harness with practiced hands, and then he held it under the room's examination light and turned it until he found the place she was talking about. The clip was there. It didn't belong to any standard military K9 harness system. It was manufacturer adjacent, close enough to pass a quick inspection, wrong enough that a slow look caught it. Wired through the padding, connection point at the neck junction, with a receiver frequency stamped in characters small enough to need reading glasses. Harwick stared at it for a long time. "When you came in tonight," Nora said carefully, "who else had access to this harness between the last reported incident and arrival here?" Harwick set the harness down on the examination table with the precise, controlled movement of a man who was not going to let himself react to something in front of an audience. He turned to look at her fully for the first time, and she saw in his face something complicated. Anger, yes, but underneath it something that looked almost like grief. "The contractor escort," he said, "from Meridian Systems. I was with the transport unit." Nora nodded. "He's still in the building," Harwick said. "He's in the waiting area." "I know," Nora said. She stood up and looked toward the evaluation room door. "I walked past him on my way to rounds. He had a remote in his left jacket pocket, small, black, about the size of a garage opener." The room absorbed that. Then Harwick moved toward the door, and the look on his face was the kind that rooms tended to clear in front of. "Commander." She said it once, quietly, and he stopped. "You should call whoever you call when a piece of military equipment has been tampered with, before you go into that waiting room." A muscle moved in his jaw. "Yeah," he said. "I know." But the way he said it suggested the phone call and the waiting room were going to happen in a specific order, and the phone call was going to be second. Nora looked down at Coda. The dog was watching the door where Harwick had gone with an alert, focused attention that had nothing of the panic from earlier. His ears were up. His body language had reorganized itself into something that looked almost purposeful. She sat back down on the floor next to him and put her hand back on his side, feeling the steadier rhythm of his breathing now. She knew what was coming. She'd seen this kind of thing before, but not this exactly, not this situation, but the shape of it, the tampered equipment, the behavioral deterioration used as cover, the contractor with access and a pocket full of tools nobody was supposed to notice. She also knew that the moment Harwick made his call, this room was going to get very complicated very fast, and her role in what had happened tonight was going to require explaining to people who hadn't been here for it. She should have felt tired. She'd been on shift for 15 hours. Her coffee was cold in the break room. What she felt instead was a quiet, settled attention. The same thing she'd felt sitting on the floor of the intake bay with a 110-pound dog who'd terrified everyone else in the building. From down the corridor, she heard voices rise. One of them Harwick's, one of them unfamiliar, and then a third voice that was sharp and official and didn't sound like anyone who'd been in the building when she started her shift tonight. Coda's ears swiveled toward the door. "Easy," she said. The dog looked back at her, and then the lights in the corridor went out. The corridor went dark for 4 seconds exactly. Nora knew it was 4 seconds because she counted, not out of panic, but because her brain did that automatically in situations where the clock suddenly mattered. 4 seconds of complete black, the kind that came from a breaker trip rather than a bulb failure, the kind that took out multiple circuits at once. Then the emergency generator kicked in, and the hallway filled with the sickly amber of backup lighting, everything cast in a flat yellowish wash that turned familiar spaces slightly wrong. Coda was on his feet before the emergency lights came up. He hadn't made a sound, no bark, no alarm vocalization, but he was standing with his body angled toward the door, every muscle in his frame oriented and waiting. It was the first time all night that his alertness had looked like readiness rather than terror, and Nora noticed the difference immediately. She got up off the floor. The voices in the corridor had stopped. That was more concerning than the lights going out. She moved to the evaluation room door and opened it carefully, staying low and to the left of the frame. Out of habit, she couldn't entirely explain. Old muscle memory from a context she didn't volunteer. The amber-lit corridor was empty in the direction of the nursing station. In the other direction, toward the waiting area, there were 2 figures she recognized by silhouette. Harwick, unmistakable in his stance, and someone shorter beside him whose posture had the specific arrangement of a person who'd been stopped mid-attempt at something. A third silhouette, unfamiliar, angular, with the wide-shouldered shape of tactical gear, was coming fast from the main entrance. Not running, moving at the deliberate, ground-eating pace of someone trained to cover distance quickly without triggering a response. Military. Not the same unit as Harwick. Nora pulled the evaluation room door most of the way closed behind her, leaving enough gap to track what was happening without putting herself directly in the hallway. Coda pressed against her leg. She reached down and put a hand on his back without looking at him. "Stay," she said quietly. The dog stayed. What she pieced together over the next 11 minutes came from fragments, half-heard exchanges, what she could see through the door gap, and what Priya told her afterward in a breathless, slightly horrified download in the break room. The contractor from Meridian Systems, his name was Aldous Fenn, though Nora didn't learn that until later, had been in the waiting area when Harwick came through the door. He'd apparently read something in Harwick's face that told him the next few minutes were going to go badly, because he'd moved immediately toward the facility's side exit. He'd also, according to the security log that got pulled the following morning, killed the main breaker on his way. There was an access panel in the waiting room corridor that most visitors never noticed. The 4 seconds of darkness had been meant to buy him a head start. It hadn't worked, because Harwick hadn't needed to see where he was going. He'd tracked Fenn in the dark by sound, which was not a skill most people had, and which Fenn had apparently not accounted for. The third figure, the wide-shouldered one in tactical gear, was an agent from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. Harwick had made his call before coming into the waiting room after all. He'd just made it fast. Fenn was detained in the parking lot. The remote was in his jacket pocket. The harness with its embedded stimulation device was photographed, bagged, and logged as evidence before 2 a.m. None of that was what Nora spent the rest of the night processing. What she spent the rest of the night processing was the conversation she had with Dr. Osh at 2:15 in the morning in his office, with the door closed and Tully sitting in the chair to the right of the desk, with his arms folded and his expression arranged into something professionally neutral that she'd seen on his face before and had never trusted. "We need to understand your background more clearly," Osh started. He was a man who approached difficult conversations by organizing them into administrative categories, which meant he felt more comfortable when he could file things. "Your employment records list you as having a veterinary trauma nursing certification and 2 years of civilian practice prior to Callaway. But the behavioral assessment you performed tonight—" "I observed the dog," Nora said. "I reported what I saw." "You identified a covert stimulation device embedded in classified military equipment. You described its operational mechanics. You predicted behavioral responses with a level of precision that isn't consistent with— I've read extensively on military working dog training and behavioral trauma," she said. "It's not classified information." Tully leaned forward slightly. "What you described to Commander Harwick about the device's receiver frequency required familiarity with operational equipment specifications. That's not in any public literature, Nora." She looked at him steadily. "I read the stamp on the device. The frequency was printed on it." "The stamp is a classified component identifier. Knowing what it meant required knowing what an EMTAC-6 receiver looks like," she said. "Which I do." Silence. Osh set his pen down. "How do you know what an EMTAC-6 receiver looks like?" She didn't answer right away. Not because she was hiding something, or not only because of that, but because the answer was long, and she was trying to figure out how much of it was relevant and how much of it was going to complicate the next 3 hours of everyone's night in ways that weren't going to help Coda. "I had a different job before nursing," she said finally. Tully's expression didn't shift, but something in his posture recalibrated. "What kind of job?" "Military adjacent, behavioral research, combat animal programs, overseas training support. I left that work 5 years ago and transitioned into civilian veterinary nursing." She kept her voice even. "It's all on my background clearance documentation if you submitted it properly when I was hired, which you were required to do." Another silence, longer this time. Osh and Tully exchanged a look that Nora couldn't quite read, somewhere between caught out and rearranging, and she understood from that look that they had not in fact reviewed her clearance documentation in any meaningful depth. She was a trauma nurse on an overnight shift. She'd been categorized and filed and not looked at again. "I'm going to need to make some calls," Osh said. "That's fine," Nora said. "Can I go back to my patient?" Us. Harwick was in the observation room adjacent to the ward when she came back, standing with his arms crossed, looking through the glass at Coda, who had been settled into a quiet kennel space with the lights low and the overhead ventilation damped to minimize noise. The dog was lying down but not sleeping, head up, tracking the room, alert in a way that looked like watchfulness rather than anxiety. "He's settling," Nora said, coming to stand beside Harwick. "Yeah." His voice was different than it had been earlier. The clipped command register was gone, replaced by something more tired and more human. "He used to do that, settle fast, even after hard training days." He was quiet for a moment. "He stopped about 8 weeks ago. I thought it was me, that I was doing something wrong." "How long has Fen been embedded in your unit?" Harwick's jaw moved. 9 weeks. Meridian Systems sent him as a tech support liaison when we transitioned to the updated harness platform. A pause. "That's a pretty standard arrangement. They send a rep, they train the handlers on the new gear, they stay on for a month or two to troubleshoot." "And Coda's behavior started deteriorating at week 1. He turned to look at her. "You think he was running the device from the start?" "I think someone was, whether Fen himself or someone directing him remotely. That's for DCIS to sort out." She watched Coda through the glass. "But the behavioral pattern is consistent with intermittent, aversive stimulus over an extended period. It wouldn't have been constant. That would have been too obvious. The dog would have broken down faster and more completely. It would have been episodic. Random intervals. Specifically timed to coincide with moments that could be attributed to something else. To training stress," Harwick said. "That's what I was told. That the operational tempo was too high and Coda was showing stress responses." which created a justification for behavioral reports, which created a paper trail. She kept her eyes on the dog. A dog that's been classified as behaviorally unstable has limited operational future. If someone needed Coda out of the field for reasons that had nothing to do with his behavior, we had an intelligence operation last month, Harwick said slowly. Coda detected a perimeter compromise before any of our electronic equipment did. We reported it up the chain, which meant it went through contractor communication channels. He stopped. There were people who didn't want that detection flagged. Nora turned to look at him. He looked back at her, and she could see him adding things up. He found something, Harwick said, and someone decided that was a problem. I can't tell you what Coda found, she said, but I can tell you that what was done to him to make him seem unstable was deliberate and systematic. He was never broken. He was being controlled. Harwick put a hand flat against the observation glass. The gesture wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of thing you did without thinking about it, when something on the other side of a barrier needed to know you were there. Coda's head turned toward the glass. His tail moved, once, twice. Not the full-body enthusiasm of a dog at play, but something quieter. Recognition. Yeah, Harwick said softly. Okay. By 4 a.m, Callaway Military Animal Medical Center had 4 people in it who hadn't been there at midnight. 2 were DCIS agents, the one from the parking lot, and a second who'd arrived in a separate vehicle. The third was a woman from the Military Veterinary Oversight Office named Salter, who wore civilian clothes and spoke very little and wrote a great deal in a small notebook. The fourth was a man Nora didn't get a name for, who spent 20 minutes with Harwick in a closed room and then left without speaking to anyone else. Tully had gone home. Osh hadn't, but he'd retreated to his office and the door was shut and the light was on, and Nora had the impression that he was having a difficult sequence of phone conversations. She should have been off shift at 8. It was 4:15. She was not going to be off shift at 8. Priya brought her a sandwich from the vending machine, the acceptable kind, turkey and cheese, not the alarming egg salad, and sat on the bench in the hallway outside the ward while Nora ate it. Tully told Osh before he left that you falsified your employment background, Priya said. She wasn't being inflammatory about it. She was stating a fact and watching Nora's face to see how she took it. What did Osh say? He said he needed to review your file. She paused. Which I think means he doesn't know what's in your file. My file is complete, Nora said. The military background is in there, the research program, the overseas assignments. It's all documented. Why didn't you tell anyone? Nora ate a bite of sandwich. People hear veterinary trauma nurse on the overnight shift, and they decide what that means. If I'd come in on day 1 and said, I used to run behavioral assessment programs for military K-9 units in forward deployed environments, Tully would have spent the next 6 months trying to prove I was wrong about things. Priya considered that. So you let them assume. I didn't correct them. That's the same thing. It isn't, Nora said. Correcting people requires that they ask a question first. Nobody asked. Priya was quiet for a moment. Outside, the generator hum filled the silence, steady and low. The DCIS woman, Salter, she was asking questions about you, about how you identified the device, about your history here. Nora set the rest of the sandwich down. What kind of questions? Specific ones. She knew your name before anyone told her. Priya looked at her steadily. She didn't seem surprised by anything she was being told, more like she was confirming something. That was new information. Nora sat with it for a moment, examining it from several angles. Okay, she said. Okay? That's it? What would you like me to say? Priya made a frustrated gesture. I don't know, something that explains why a DCIS agent apparently already knew who you were before a military dog got brought in tonight and everything went sideways. Nora picked up the sandwich again. I genuinely don't know why that is, she said, but I'd like to find out. Salter found her at 5:30 in the ward, where Nora was doing a hands-on check of Coda's neck and throat, looking for any tissue damage at the contact points, any sign of prolonged irritation from the device. The dog was cooperative in a way that still felt slightly provisional, like he'd extended a trial membership and was watching to see if it got renewed. The DCIS agent was compact, economical in her movements, maybe 50 years old, with the kind of face that gave nothing away as a matter of professional practice. She stood in the doorway of the kennel space and watched Nora work for about 30 seconds before she spoke. You were in the Farview program, Salter said. Not a question. Nora's hands kept moving along Coda's neck, checking the lymph nodes systematically. That program was classified. It was declassified 18 months ago, partially. Salter stepped into the space. You left in the 3rd year. We weren't sure if it was voluntary. It was voluntary. What made you leave? Nora sat back on her heels and looked at the agent. I disagreed with the direction the program was taking, specifically with the decision to expand the aversive conditioning protocols beyond the research parameters we'd started with. She kept her voice level. I wrote a formal objection. I was told the decision had been made above my level. I resigned. Salter nodded slowly. The Farview program was shut down 14 months ago. 3 of the researchers who stayed on after you left have given statements suggesting the expanded protocols crossed into territory that shouldn't have been authorized. She paused. Your objection memo is part of the record. It's why your name is in our file. Nora looked at her. The device in Coda's harness, Salter continued. It's a 3rd-generation build using techniques that originated in the expanded Farview protocols. We've been looking for where the technology went after the program closed, where the people went. She pulled out the small notebook. Meridian Systems hired 4 former Farview contractors in the 6 months after the shutdown. Aldous Fenn was one of them. The pieces weren't difficult to connect. The technology, the contractors, the systematic use of aversive stimulus to manipulate a working dog's behavior and create a paper trail of apparent instability. And underneath it, whatever Coda had detected that someone had needed to disappear. How many dogs? Nora asked. Salter didn't look away. Coda is the 8th case we've identified in the last 5 months. The other 7 were all cleared from service on behavioral grounds. She paused. 4 of them were euthanized before we made the connection. The number sat in the air between them. Nora put her hand back on Coda's head. He leaned into it slightly, the weight of a large dog pushing gently back against a steady hand. What do you need from me? She asked. Your technical expertise with the Farview-derived systems. Your knowledge of how the behavioral manipulation was structured, what the evidence trail looks like, how to distinguish it from genuine deterioration. Salter's voice was precise and without theater. And your testimony, when we get to that stage. I'll need to talk to my supervisor. Dr. Osh has already been briefed. As of this conversation, you're being temporarily reassigned to support the investigation while continuing your role here. A pause. The reassignment isn't optional, but your cooperation is technically. Technically, Nora repeated. Yes. She looked down at Coda for a moment. The dog was watching her with that focused, quiet attention he'd had since the crisis broke. Something alert and reading and fundamentally present in a way that felt different from how he'd arrived. The other dogs, she said. The 3 that weren't euthanized, where are they? 2 are in behavioral facilities. 1 is still with his unit, currently flagged as non-deployable. Are they being treated with the same protocols that created the problem? Salter paused. A fractional pause, but there. I don't have visibility into the specific treatment methodologies. Get visibility, Nora said, because if they're in standard behavioral facilities running graduated exposure protocols, those dogs are experiencing the same environment that Coda deteriorated in tonight. The aversive conditioning doesn't clear on its own. Putting them in structured behavioral programs without addressing the physiological sensitization first is going to make them worse. She looked up. I'll support your investigation, but those 3 dogs need to be assessed immediately, and the facilities holding them need to understand what they're actually dealing with, Salter wrote in her notebook. I'll make the calls. Make them before 8, Nora said, and I need the behavioral files on all 8 cases. Whatever records Meridian submitted, whatever the unit commanders have. All of it. That's a significant volume of classified documentation. Yes. Nora stood up. You said I was being reassigned to support the investigation. That's what the investigation needs. A pause. Then Salter nodded once and closed her notebook. The morning shift started arriving at 7. Nora was at the nursing station when they came in. Petra, the morning charge, who stopped in the doorway with her bag over her shoulder and stared at the aftermath of the night, with the expression of someone arriving at a party and discovering it had been a different kind of event than advertised. 3 unfamiliar vehicles in the parking lot, DCIS credentials visible on 2 people in the main corridor. Calloway's intake bay cordoned off with yellow evidence tape. What happened? Petra asked. Long night, Nora said. She finished her last chart update and saved it. Coda's in Kennel 4. He needs another check at 9 in low-stimulus environment through at least noon. No overhead lights, no excess personnel in the space. He'll accept handling from me and from Commander Harwick. Who's Coda? Military working dog Malinois came in at midnight. He's the reason the intake bay is taped off. She picked up her bag. His behavioral file is on the system. I updated it through 5 a.m. The DCIS agent, Salter, she'll be back by 8. Direct any clinical questions about Coda to me, not to Dr. Tully. Petra looked at her carefully. Is there a reason? Tully's not on this case anymore. Nora said it without inflection. Osh knows. She walked out into the early morning, cold Idaho air, the sky doing that thin, pale thing it did before the sun committed to being up, and sat in her car in the parking lot for 6 minutes without starting it, which was long enough to feel the tiredness settle into her properly, the kind that came after adrenaline burned out and left its residue. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number, which under ordinary circumstances she wouldn't answer. She answered it. Ms. Vass. The voice was male, unhurried, and had the particular quality of someone who was accustomed to making calls that people took seriously. My name is Croft. I'm the deputy director of the program that ran Meridian Systems defense contracts. I'm calling because I understand you've been in contact with the DCIS investigative team tonight. Nora said nothing. I want to be clear that we consider Aldous Fenn's actions to be unauthorized and outside any scope approved by this office, Croft continued. Meridian Systems has always operated within... Mr. Croft. She kept her voice flat. You're calling a civilian nursing staff member at 6:50 in the morning to brief her on your organization's official position. A pause. I'm calling to ensure there's no misunderstanding about the chain of accountability. Who gave you this number? Another pause, longer this time. That's what I thought, Nora said, and ended the call. She sat for another moment with the phone in her hand, and then she started her car and drove home. And before she'd made it to the end of the facility road, her phone buzzed again. This time Salter's number, which she'd saved. And the message was 3 words, call me, now. Nora pulled over. She called. Salter picked up on the first ring. Someone flagged your personnel file 40 minutes ago. Internal system, modification request. They were trying to pull your clearance documentation before our team could access it. Her voice was tight in a way it hadn't been at 5:30. We blocked it, but whoever submitted the request has Level 4 authorization. Level 4 was not a contractor. Fenn didn't act alone, Nora said. No, Salter said, and whoever is above him just made their first mistake. A pause. I need you back here, Nora. Not in an hour. Now. Nora looked at the facility building in her rearview mirror. The parking lot lights were still on, burning pale in the early morning. One of the DCIS vehicles was pulling back in. I never left the lot, she said, and put the car in reverse. She put the car in reverse and pulled back into the lot before Salter had finished the sentence. The DCIS vehicle that had been pulling in was a dark SUV, and it stopped 2 spaces from hers. The agent who got out wasn't Salter. He was younger, maybe 32, with the specific kind of alertness that came from being woken up and briefed in transit. He saw Nora and moved toward her without hesitating, which meant Salter had told him what she looked like. Voss? He mispronounced it. Vass, she said. Agent Decker. Salter's on her way from the evidence processing site. 20 minutes. He held the facility door open. She wants you in the conference room with access to Coda's full file and the Meridian documentation. We've been authorized to pull the classified components. The personnel file access attempt, Nora said as she walked through. Have you traced the authorization level yet? Working on it. He let the door close behind them. What we know is it came through the Defense Acquisitions Oversight Network, which puts it above contractor grade. Somebody with procurement authority tried to strip your clearance documentation before we could pull it into evidence. He paused. That's a federal obstruction charge on top of everything else. Whoever did it wasn't thinking clearly. Or they were panicking, Nora said. Same result for us. The conference room at Calloway was designed for staff meetings. A long table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard that still had last month's vaccination schedule written on it. By 7:15, it had been converted into something that looked like a field investigation hub, which involved a lot of cables, 2 additional laptops, and a cardboard box of physical files that Agent Decker had carried in from the SUV. Nora sat at one end of the table and started reading. The Meridian Systems documentation was dense and carefully organized, which was itself a kind of evidence. The operational records for their K9 equipment support program were meticulous in a way that looked designed for auditing. Clean invoice trails, standardized service reports, handler sign-off sheets for every equipment interaction. It was the kind of documentation that said we knew this would be reviewed someday in every margin. The behavioral records for the 8 dogs were in a separate folder, and those told a different story. Each dog had a timeline of behavioral reports submitted by their assigned handlers. Normal at first, then escalating concern notes, then formal instability assessments, then clinical recommendations for behavioral evaluation. In every case, the timeline from first concern note to formal non-deployable classification was between 6 and 10 weeks. In every case, the assigned Meridian technical liaison had been present for all equipment interactions during that window. In 5 of the 8 cases, the dog had detected something in the field: a perimeter compromise, a concealed ordnance, a surveillance device. In the weeks immediately before the behavioral deterioration began, Nora lined those 5 cases up in order and sat looking at them. Not random, not opportunistic. These were dogs that had found things someone needed unfound, and the response had been to methodically dismantle their credibility as operational animals. A dog classified as behaviorally unstable couldn't give evidence. Its detections became unreliable in retrospect. Whatever it had found could be reframed as a false alert from an animal in deteriorating condition. It was sophisticated, it was patient, and it had been running for at least a year before DCIS started connecting the pattern. "You're making a face," Decker said from across the table. 5 of the 8 dogs made a significant detection before the deterioration started, she said. "I need to know what those detections were. Specifically what they led to operationally, what reports were filed, what actions were taken. That's deep operational intel. I can't pull that in this room." "Consult her?" A pause. "Maybe." "Then it needs to be on her list." Nora turned back to the files. "Because if the pattern holds, the detections are the motive. The dogs weren't targeted because someone wanted to sell equipment or run a behavioral research program. They were targeted because specific dogs found specific things, and removing those dogs from service was a way of managing what got reported up the chain." Decker was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant claim." "It's what the files say." She set the behavioral report for dog number 3, a German shepherd named Talus, euthanized 11 weeks ago, down on the table. Talus detected something in week 1 of his Meridian Liaison's assignment, behavioral report filed at week 2, non-deployable classification at week 8, euthanized at week 10 after a failed behavioral rehabilitation attempt. She looked up. The rehabilitation facility used graduated exposure protocols with electronic compliance aids. She watched Decker work out what that meant. "They were finishing the job," he said. "Someone at the rehabilitation facility either knew what they were doing or was given protocols by someone who did." She closed the folder. "I need those facility names and their clinical records." Oh. Salter arrived at 7:48 with mud on her boots and the expression of someone who had already made 12 calls that morning and hadn't liked the answers to most of them. She dropped a secure tablet on the table in front of Nora without preamble. "Operational summaries for the 5 detection cases. Redacted in places, but you'll see the pattern." Nora pulled the tablet toward her and started reading. The pattern was worse than she'd expected, which was saying something. 3 of the 5 detections had led to reports that were later officially reclassified as inconclusive or false positive. In the official record, the reclassification had been supported by the behavioral instability reports filed by the unit commanders, which created a circular logic that was almost elegant in its construction. The dog detected something. The contractor began the behavioral deterioration process. The detection was reclassified as unreliable because the dog was now documented as unstable, and whatever had been detected remained in place or was quietly removed by whoever had placed it. In 2 of the 3 reclassified cases, the detection had involved surveillance infrastructure, devices hidden inside military facilities. Someone had been running active surveillance inside 2 U.S. military installations, And when working dogs found the devices, they'd used Meridian systems to erase the evidence and discredit the dogs that found it. Nora set the tablet down. "This is an equipment fraud," she said. Salter looked at her steadily. "No. The equipment fraud is the mechanism. The actual operation is counterintelligence sabotage." She kept her voice flat because the alternative was letting the weight of it show in a way that wasn't useful right now. Someone has been running assets inside military facilities and using a contractor network to protect those assets by eliminating the detection capability that threatened them. That's our current assessment, yes. Coda found a surveillance device. Coda found two, Salter said, both in classified briefing spaces. Both removed before the formal detection report could be acted on. The reclassification happened within 48 hours of his alert. She paused. The devices haven't been recovered. We don't know what was transmitted or to whom. Harwick was in the hallway. Nora hadn't seen him come in, but he was visible through the conference room's narrow window strip, standing with his back to the wall, arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular with the face of a man who'd been given a similar briefing sometime in the last hour and was still metabolizing it. "He knows," Nora said. "He was told 20 minutes ago." She looked at Salter. "Who's above Fenn? You said someone with level 4 authorization tried to pull my file. That's not a contractor. We have a name. I'm not going to share it in this room yet because the moment that name circulates, whoever it is will know the net is closing and will lose the opportunity to trace the full network." Salter's voice was precise. "What I can tell you is that the person who called you this morning, Croft, from the deputy director's office, is not who he said he was. There is a deputy director at that office. The name Croft doesn't appear in their personnel directory." The call had been a probe. Someone trying to assess how much she knew and how she was going to respond to pressure. She'd ended it fast enough that she hadn't given them much, but they'd identified themselves as scared, which was useful. "They're going to move," Nora said. "If they know DCIS is active and that the Coda case is what opened the investigation, they'll try to accelerate whatever they have in place and minimize their exposure. We're aware of that." "Then you need to move faster." She stood up. "The behavioral files on the other dogs. The two still in facilities and the one with his unit. I need those today. Not for the investigation, for the dogs themselves. If whoever is running this realizes those animals are still alive and still potentially able to demonstrate that the deterioration was induced, they may decide the cleaner option is, I've already made those calls," Salter said. "All 3 animals are being placed under protective custody as of this morning. Their current facilities have been instructed to halt all behavioral treatment protocols pending review." Nora let out a breath she hadn't been managing carefully enough. "Good. The review team needs someone to lead the clinical assessment, someone who understands both the far-view methodology and what the induced deterioration looks like physiologically." Salter met her eyes. "I know you've been on shift for 16 hours. 18, Nora said. "What do you need?" What Salter needed took most of the morning. The clinical assessment framework Nora put together was based on the far-view research she'd left behind 5 years ago, cross-referenced with what she could extract from Meridian's own service records. The device specifications, the frequency ranges, the application protocols that Fenn and his colleagues had been using. She wrote it out longhand first, which she hadn't done since graduate school, because working on paper helped her think in a way that screens didn't. The physiological signature of induced aversive conditioning was distinct from genuine behavioral deterioration if you knew what to look for. Specific sensitization patterns in the startle response, asymmetric trigger profiles that tracked with particular environmental variables, rather than generalized anxiety, cortisol elevation that peaked in patterns inconsistent with operational stress. A dog that was genuinely breaking down under operational pressure showed different markers than a dog that had been methodically destabilized by intermittent pain stimulus. She documented all of it: the markers, the assessment protocols, the differentiation criteria. The rehabilitation approach, which was not the graduated exposure model used by the facilities currently holding the 3 surviving dogs, but a longer, slower process built around rebuilding associative safety rather than extinguishing fear responses. At 10:30, Dr. Osh came into the conference room. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the files and the agents and Nora at the end of the table with her handwritten pages, And then he came in and sat down across from her with the deliberate movement of a man who had made a decision and was going to say it cleanly. "Your clearance documentation was complete," he said. "I reviewed it this morning. It's been in your file since your hiring date." Nora looked at him. "I should have read it when you came on staff." He said it without decoration. "I categorized you and moved on, and that was a failure of process on my end." "It was," she said. He absorbed that without flinching, which she gave him some credit for. "What do you need from the facility to support this work?" "Coda needs to stay here through his rehabilitation. I need control of his clinical plan without Tully's involvement. Tully's protocols are contraindicated for his specific condition, and I don't want a conflict of clinical authority every time I make a decision." She kept her tone neutral. "I also need access to the behavioral data for the other 3 dogs as it comes in, and I need to be able to consult on their treatment plans remotely." "Done." He paused. "Tully is going on administrative leave pending a review of his conduct last night." She hadn't expected that. "That's your call to make." "It is." He stood. "For what it's worth, what you did in that evaluation room, sitting down on the floor with a dog that had just put 3 people in the medical bay." He paused. "I don't know if it was brave or just correct. Usually those are the same thing," she said. He nodded once and left. Harwick came in at 11. He'd clearly slept, maybe 2 hours, maybe less, and showered, and the exhaustion that had been moving through his face all night had settled into something more permanent looking, the kind that needed more than sleep to fix. He sat in the chair across from Nora without being invited, which she didn't mind. "Salter briefed me on the full picture," he said. "I know. 2 surveillance devices in classified briefing spaces." He set his hands flat on the table. "I've been in those spaces. My team has been in those spaces. Whatever was transmitted, it included—" He stopped. Started again. "It included operational planning material." She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wasn't going to make it worse. "He found them," Harwick said. "In week 1 of Fenn's assignment. Coda found them. I reported the alerts through the standard channel, the channel that went through contractor communications. And 48 hours later, the detections were reclassified as false positives by an officer I've worked with for 3 years." He looked at his hands. "I believed it. I believed the reclassification because Coda was already starting to show the behavior changes, and I thought I'd been pushing him too hard. That's what it was designed to make you think. I know that now." He looked up. "Doesn't make the last 9 weeks feel like something other than what they were." "No," she agreed. "It wouldn't." He was quiet for a moment. "The officer who reclassified the detection, is he—" "I don't have a name," Nora said once and let it go, which told her more about his discipline than most things would have. "Coda," he said. "What's his prognosis?" "Good, if we do it right. The sensitization is real, but it's not permanent. The nervous system is adaptive, and he's young, and he has a solid behavioral foundation under the induced damage. The rehabilitation is going to take 3 to 4 months minimum. He won't be deployable inside that window." She paused. "After, depending on how he responds, possibly full recovery of function." Harwick absorbed that. "What does right look like?" "Slow, no pressure timelines, trust-based reintroduction to the things that were paired with pain stimulus. It's the opposite of what he's been through, which means it can feel like nothing is happening for weeks at a time." She looked at him directly. "And you can't rush it because you need him back. That's the hardest part for handlers." He held eye contact with her. "I put my team's operational security in the hands of someone I didn't vet personally because the paperwork looked clean and the equipment looked right, and I was tired." A pause. "I'm not going to rush my dog's recovery because I want things to go back to normal." She believed him. Not because she was generous with trust, but because she had spent 18 hours watching him, and he was a man who was capable of making the same mistake twice, but who didn't make it lightly the first time. "There's something else," he said. "Tell me." "The officer who reclassified Coda's detection. His name came up this morning in a different context." Harwick's voice was carefully controlled. "He's currently inside the main DCIS field office in Boise, meeting with the senior agent in charge of this investigation." Nora went still. "He requested the meeting 40 minutes ago, framed it as voluntary cooperation. Salter doesn't know yet because she's been in this building." He looked at her. I got a message from someone in my chain of command 20 minutes ago. Whoever this officer is, he's not going there to cooperate. He's going to see what DCIS has and to identify who gave it to them. Harwick's eyes were level. Which means if they tell him anything about the investigation's current status, he'll know about me, Nora said. He'll know about the clinical documentation, the assessment framework, the evidence chain from the harness device through the behavioral files through the Farview connection. He paused. You're the link that holds all of it together. Without your testimony and your technical expertise, the evidentiary structure gets a lot more complicated to prosecute. The conference room felt smaller than it had an hour ago. She looked at the handwritten pages in front of her, the assessment framework, the rehabilitation protocols, the documentation of what had been done to 8 military working dogs and why. Hours of work, years of knowledge, assembled and organized and made available for something that needed it. Call Salter, she said, right now. Harwick was already reaching for his phone. The door to the conference room opened. It wasn't Decker, and it wasn't Osh, and it wasn't anyone Nora recognized. The man in the doorway was wearing civilian clothes, good ones, deliberately unremarkable, and he had a visitor badge clipped to his jacket lapel that was the wrong color for the type of access it was supposed to represent. She knew this because she had issued visitor badges as part of her intake rotation twice a week for the past 11 months, and the color coding wasn't something that changed. He looked at Nora first, then at the files spread across the table, then at Harwick. His expression was the expression of someone who had just walked into a room expecting to find one thing and found something considerably more complicated, and who was deciding in real time how to adjust. Harwick's hand had stopped moving toward his phone. "Commander Harwick," the man said. His voice was unhurried, professionally warm, the register of someone who gave briefings to rooms full of people who outranked him and had learned how to fill a space with calm authority. "I heard you were here. I wanted to check in personally. This situation with your K-9, the contractor misconduct. Who authorized your access to this building?" Nora said. He looked at her. Up close, he was maybe 55, silver at the temples, the kind of fit that spoke to deliberate maintenance. "I'm sorry?" "Your visitor badge is blue," she said. "Blue is medical staff and overnight clinical support. Visitor access for non-clinical personnel is yellow. The desk would have issued you a yellow badge because you're not on the clinical staff list." She kept her voice even. "So either the desk made an error or you switched badges somewhere between the entrance and this room." A pause. "I think there may have been some confusion at the desk," he said. "I can go clarify." "What's your name?" Harwick said. He was on his feet now, and whatever the man had read in the room when he walked in, he was reading something different in Harwick's posture. The man's phone buzzed in his jacket. He glanced down at it, just for a second, just a fraction of a second, and something crossed his face that he didn't control fast enough. Nora had seen that expression before. She had seen it on Fenn's face, right before the lights went out. It was the expression of someone receiving information that changed what the next 30 seconds needed to look like. She put her hand on the table in front of the handwritten pages without thinking about it, a reflex like covering something. And then Harwick was already moving, already between her and the door, and from somewhere down the corridor there was the sound of Salter's voice, sharp and clear, saying a single name that Nora didn't catch. The man's hand went to his jacket, not to his phone this time. And from Kennel 4, from down the corridor through 2 sets of doors, came a sound that cut through everything else. Low, certain, directional. Not a bark. Not a panic response. An alert. Coda had found something again. The alert from Kennel 4 lasted exactly 3 seconds before it cut off. Not because Coda stopped, because the sound moved, clarified, shifted from general alarm into something more specific and directed. Even through 2 sets of doors, it was unmistakable to anyone who understood what it meant. A working dog at full alert didn't sound like fear and didn't sound like aggression. It sounded like communication, like something with a specific meaning that the animal needed a human to understand fast. Harwick understood it. He was already angled between Nora and the man in the doorway, and his right hand had moved in a way that suggested it knew where it was going without requiring a conscious decision from him. The man's own hand had stopped at his jacket, not completing whatever motion it had started, just stopped, arrested mid-reach by the calculation of what Harwick's posture was telling him about the odds. "Don't," Harwick said. One word, no inflection. The kind of don't that didn't need to explain itself. The man's hand came back to his side. Down the corridor, Salter's voice sharpened. She'd heard the alert too. And then there were footsteps, fast ones, and Decker came through the far door at a pace that was nearly a run. He read the room in the 2 seconds it took him to cross it, and then he was beside the man in the doorway with his credentials out and his hand on the man's arm before the man had time to reframe the situation into something manageable. Identification, Decker said. The man looked at Decker, then at Harwick, then at Nora. A quick triangulating look, assessing, calculating. Then he reached slowly into his jacket and produced a credentials wallet that he opened and held out. Decker looked at it. His face didn't change exactly, but something in it went very careful. This says you're Colonel Wendell Price, Defense Intelligence. That's correct. Colonel Price was reported as being at the DCIS field office in Boise 40 minutes ago, Decker said. I left early. The field office is 90 minutes from this facility. A pause. Short, but there. Sir, Decker said, I need you to come with me. Pakam. Nora didn't follow them out. She sat in the conference room for approximately 90 seconds, long enough for the immediate noise of it to move down the corridor, and then she gathered the handwritten pages from the table, stacked them against her chest, and went to Kennel 4. Kota was standing at the kennel door, alert posture, head up, still oriented toward the corridor where the man had been. When he saw Nora come through the ward door, he held his position for a moment, verifying, processing, and then his posture shifted just slightly, the particular relaxation of an animal that has delivered its message and confirmed it was received. She crouched in front of the kennel. I know, she said quietly. Good boy. His tail moved twice, the same restrained acknowledgement as the night before. He was not a demonstrative dog at baseline, she was realizing. The tail movement was significant. She reached through the kennel door and he put his nose against her hand and held it there for a few seconds, then stepped back and lay down with his head up, watching the ward entrance. Still on duty, still working. She sat on the floor against the kennel wall, the same way she'd sat on the floor of the evaluation room, the same way she'd sat in the intake bay, because floors were where you went when you needed to be at a dog's level, and also when you needed to think without the distraction of furniture, and looked at the handwritten pages in her lap. The alert mattered beyond the immediate situation. Kota had been in a kennel space since 2 a.m., with no access to the corridor, no physical contact with anyone except Nora and the morning tech who'd brought his food. He shouldn't have had information about who was in the building. He shouldn't have been able to detect a threat from someone he'd never encountered in that context. Except that working dogs at Kota's certification level didn't just detect substances and perimeter compromises. They read rooms. They read people. They spent years being trained to pattern match against human behavioral cues that indicated concealment, threat, preparation for violence. And whatever Colonel Wendell Price, or whoever was actually carrying those credentials, had been carrying in that jacket, Kota had known about it through 2 closed doors at a distance that should have been beyond his operational range, which meant either Kota's detection capabilities were more intact than his behavioral file suggested, or the man had been so saturated with whatever he was carrying that the concentration was unusually high. Both of those things were useful to know. She was still sitting on the floor when Salter came in 22 minutes later. The agent looked at her on the floor against the kennel wall with the calm of someone who had stopped being surprised by Nora's choices several hours ago. She pulled a chair over from the corner and sat in it, which put them at roughly the same height. Price's credentials are real, Salter said. He is Colonel Wendell Price. He is Defense Intelligence, and he was at the field office this morning. She paused. He also left the field office 13 minutes into the meeting, claiming a family emergency. Took his personal vehicle. The agent running that meeting didn't flag it for another 40 minutes because he didn't know about the situation here yet. So he came straight here from the field office. He drove 92 minutes in 81, which tells you something about his mental state. Salter crossed her ankles. We found what Kota alerted to. He had a device in his jacket, a signal interceptor, military grade. It would have captured any active wireless communications in the building, including the secure channel we've been using. She paused. He also had a secondary phone, encrypted. We're working on it. He came here to see what you had, Nora said, and to send it out before you could move on him. That's our read. What was on the signal interceptor? Did he capture anything? He hadn't activated it yet. He'd been in the building less than 3 minutes when Decker got to the conference room. Salter looked at her. Your badge color observation gave us about 2 minutes of additional time. Maybe less. Nora thought about the man's expression when he looked at the files spread across the conference table. The quick, assessing look. He'd been doing an inventory, seeing how much was visible, how much was already in evidence form, how much could be disrupted or walked back if he acted fast. He was going to try to take the handwritten documentation, she said. The framework pages. They're the only piece of the evidence chain that exists only in physical form and hasn't been logged into the DCIS system yet. Salter looked at the pages in Nora's lap. That's what I think, too. Then we need to log them now. Nora stood up and gathered the pages carefully. All of it, today, before whoever else is in this network realizes that Price is in custody and starts making decisions about what to do with what they have. The next 6 hours had a quality she associated with certain kinds of trauma response, not the crisis itself, but the period immediately after, when the acute danger has passed and the body hasn't caught up yet, so you move through the world with a heightened efficiency that runs on something other than normal fuel. She'd been awake for over 20 hours. She ate a granola bar someone left on the conference table and didn't taste it. The handwritten framework went into evidence at 9:17 a.m. Photographs, DCIS intake log, her signature and Salter's on the chain of custody form. The originals went into a secure evidence container. She was given a copy. By 10, the Meridian Systems operational records had been cross-referenced against the personnel files for the 4 former Farview contractors, and the picture was clean enough to be almost elegant in its wrongness. 3 of the 4 had been involved in the expanded protocol development that Nora had objected to before leaving. One of them, a man named Harlan Soto, who had led the aversive conditioning expansion, had gone to Meridian Systems as a senior research director 14 months ago, the same month the Farview program was shut down. Soto's name appeared nowhere in the documents Nora had seen, but his methodology was everywhere in them. The frequency ranges, the application intervals, the specific combination of trigger pairing and timing that produced the fastest behavioral deterioration without leaving obvious physiological evidence. She recognized it the way you recognize someone's handwriting, not from the words but from the pressure of the pen. She told Salter, and Salter made a call, and 40 minutes later, a warrant had been issued for Soto's records in Meridian's research division. At 11:30, the preliminary forensic analysis came back on Price's secondary phone. Nora wasn't in the room for that. She was in the ward with Coda, doing a systematic behavioral assessment, the first proper one since his intake, now that the immediate crisis had passed, and she had a framework for what she was actually looking at. He was calmer than he'd been at any point in the previous 12 hours, which could have been fatigue or could have been something more genuine. She ran him through a series of low-pressure stimulus checks, watching his response patterns, noting what triggered the sensitized startle response and what didn't. His handler-relationship response was interesting. When Harwick came into the ward, which he did at around 11, asking quietly if he could observe, Coda tracked him immediately, oriented toward him, and held a sustained attention that wasn't anxious. It was watchful, the kind of watchfulness that preceded a decision. "You can come closer," Nora said. Harwick moved slowly, the way he'd moved in the evaluation room when everything had broken. He stopped about 6 feet from the kennel and crouched down, and Coda looked at him for a long time. Then the dog stood up, crossed the kennel, and pressed his nose against the door at the point closest to where Harwick was crouching. It wasn't reunion. It wasn't the full-body greeting of a dog who'd had a good day and was happy to see his person. It was something more provisional than that, more careful, like something that had learned to be careful about what it gave out and was choosing to give something anyway. Harwick put 2 fingers through the kennel door. The dog sniffed them and held still. "Hey," Harwick said softly. "Hey, buddy." Nora wrote something in her notes and said nothing. Decker came to find her at 12:40. He had the specific walk of someone delivering news that was significant enough to change the shape of the next several hours, and she set down her pen before he opened his mouth. "Price's phone," he said. 11 contacts. 3 of them are Meridian employees we already have in the system. 2 are offshore. We're working on those. The other 6, he paused. 4 are active military officers. 2 are civilian personnel in the Defense Acquisitions Oversight Network. The number landed wrong. Not because it was surprising, She'd known from the moment Salter mentioned the Level 4 authorization that this went high enough to be serious, but because knowing something in the abstract and having it converted into a specific number of specific people was different in a way that mattered. "How high?" she asked. "The most senior military contact is a 2-star. He said it quietly. "Which means this isn't a rogue operation. It wasn't Price acting alone, or Fenn, or even Soto's methodology sold to a contractor for profit. This is organized. It has structure. It has rank." "It has cover," Nora said. "A 2-star can authorize reclassifications, can redirect investigation priorities, can decide which detection reports get acted on and which ones get buried." "Yes." She stood up. "Does Salter know?" "She's on a secure call with the DCIS director right now, has been for the last 20 minutes. The gravity of it was doing something complicated to the room. Nora had been in situations before. Not this situation, but adjacent ones. Situations where the thread you'd been pulling turned out to be attached to something much larger than you'd initially understood. And she knew the specific feeling of standing at that moment when the scale of a thing became fully visible for the first time. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like standing at the edge of something and recalibrating your sense of depth. "The Farview connection," she said. "The expanded protocols. If Soto took the methodology to Meridian and Price's network was using it to protect surveillance assets inside military installations, who was running the surveillance? Who were the devices transmitting to?" "We don't know yet, but DCIS is going to find out." "That's above my clearance grade," Decker said. "But yes, that's the investigation now." He looked at her directly. "You're in this, Vass. Whatever happens from here, your name is in the evidence chain. Your testimony is foundational to the behavioral documentation, and the people on Price's contact list know that. Salter is going to want to talk to you about protective measures." "I don't need protective measures," she said. "I need the 3 surviving dogs to have adequate clinical supervision, and I need Price's interrogation to include questions about whether Soto's methodology was applied to any animals outside the 8 cases we've identified." Decker stared at her for a moment. "You just found out there's a 2-star general involved in a counterintelligence operation targeting your testimony, and your first concern is whether there are more dogs." "My first concern is the same as it was at midnight," she said. "The dogs, the documentation, the people who don't have a voice in what happened to them." She met his eyes. "What happens to me is a separate question, and I'll address it when it becomes the most pressing one. Right now it isn't." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded, with the expression of someone who had just recategorized something, and left. Price broke at 2:15 in the afternoon. Not fully. Not the way that made clean television, with a full confession delivered in a single dramatic statement. What actually happened was messier and more human than that. He'd been in a holding space since the morning, his credentials confirmed and his situation explained to him in full, and he'd spent several hours being precisely cooperative about procedural questions while saying nothing of substance, which was the behavior of a trained officer who understood exactly where the lines were. What broke him was the phone. Specifically, what broke him was being told that the encryption on his secondary phone had been cracked and that the 11 contacts had been identified, and that the forensic team had also recovered 42 messages that had been flagged for deletion but not yet purged. Salter told Nora this later, with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone describing a procedural outcome rather than a human moment, but Nora could construct it well enough from the description. A man who had built his operational security on a device he believed was impenetrable, being told that the impenetrable thing had taken 6 hours to crack. The 6 hours hadn't been because the encryption was good. It had been because DCIS had the right specialist, and the right specialist had been called in from a federal forensics lab in Portland at 8 in the morning at Salter's request. Price gave them 2 names. One was Harlan Soto, who they already had. The second was the 2-star, General Marcus Veld, who commanded the Oversight Committee for 3 military installation security programs in the Pacific Northwest region, who had been in his position for 4 years, and who had been routing intelligence from the surveillance devices CODA and the other working dogs, had found to a network that Price described only as foreign adjacent interests before he stopped talking and asked for legal representation. Foreign adjacent interests. The phrase was bureaucratic and bloodless, and it covered something that was neither. What it meant, in the translation from institutional language to plain fact, was that classified military planning material had been leaving those facilities. had been going somewhere, for an unknown period, through devices that military working dogs had found, and that a systematic program of contractor manipulation had then buried. General Veld was taken into federal custody at 3:47 p.m. at his office at Garrison Hale Air Installation, 30 miles from Teller. Salter told Nora this by text. The message was 4 words: Veld in custody. Hold. She was in the ward with Coda when she read it. The dog was lying in the kennel with his head on his paws, watching the ward entrance with the alert patience that seemed to be his baseline state when he wasn't in crisis. She sat on the floor next to the kennel door and looked at the message for a while. Hold meant stay where you are. Hold meant don't move or talk or communicate with anyone outside this building until Salter cleared it. She understood why. With Veld's arrest, there would be a containment effort inside the investigation. Anyone who could be a leak, anyone whose next action mattered, would be asked to hold until the immediate blast radius of the arrest could be assessed. She put her phone in her pocket and leaned her head back against the kennel wall. Coda shifted. She heard him get up, cross the kennel, and then felt the pressure of his nose through the door against her shoulder. Not checking on her, not seeking, something more like indicating. She turned her head and he was right there, close, looking at her with those amber eyes that had spent 9 weeks carrying something nobody around him had understood. Yeah, she said. I know. The formal interview request came at 4:30. Not from Salter, from a team that had come in from Washington, 2 people whose credentials sat at a level that made Decker straighten his shoulders slightly when he saw them. They were not unkind, but they were thorough in the way that official inquiries were thorough when the stakes required it, and they spent an hour and 40 minutes with Nora in the conference room, going through every step of the previous 18 hours with the methodical patience of people building a structure that needed to be able to hold significant weight. She answered every question. She did not editorialize, did not theorize beyond what the evidence directly supported, did not frame her own role in terms designed to manage how it looked. She described what she had observed, what she had inferred, and on what basis, what she had done, and why. When they asked about her background, the Farview program, the resignation, the 5 years of civilian veterinary nursing, she answered those questions with the same directness. At one point, the senior of the 2, a woman named Breslin, whose title had several words in it that Nora chose not to count, asked, "Why didn't you disclose your prior military research background when you were hired at Callaway?" "I disclosed it in my clearance documentation, which was submitted as part of my hiring packet," Nora said. "I was not asked to volunteer it verbally. No one reviewed the documentation. If someone had reviewed it, you might have been placed in a more senior clinical role." "Possibly. Does that frustrate you?" Nora considered the question for a moment. "I was good at my job as an overnight trauma nurse. The animals under my care got quality treatment. What title I held while doing it didn't change what I was able to do." She paused. "If anything, working in a role that people didn't look at too closely gave me the latitude to observe things that people in more senior positions felt they needed to have opinions about before they saw them clearly." Breslin wrote something. "Like Dr. Tully's evaluation approach. Like a lot of things." At 6 p.m., Harwick found her in the break room. She was eating the same bad coffee she'd been drinking since midnight. A fresh pot, technically, but it tasted the same, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in and sitting across from her at the table. He looked like someone who had processed a significant amount of information in the past several hours and hadn't yet decided what to do with all of it. "Veld," he said. "I heard. I worked under his command structure for 14 months. Not directly, but he was in my reporting chain." He set his hands on the table, palms down. "I briefed into his committee twice. The second time was 3 weeks after Coda's first detection alert, the one that got reclassified." He didn't look away from his hands. He was in the room for that briefing. He knew the detection had been reclassified. He signed off on the operational note that said Coda's reliability was in question. She didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. "He sat there," Harwick said. "He sat there and listened to me describe my concern about Coda's deterioration, and he recommended, on record in writing, that I pursue behavioral evaluation and consider whether the dog was suitable for continued deployment." He looked up. He was the one who suggested this facility, Callaway. He said he'd heard good things about the staff. Nora went still. "He sent you here," she said. "He sent us here." Harwick's voice was flat. With Fenn, on a transport schedule that Fenn arranged, to a facility that Price apparently visited 3 months ago and assessed for... He stopped. For something. We don't know what yet. But he chose this place deliberately. She thought about that, about the specific chain of it. Coda detecting the devices, the reclassification, the behavioral deterioration engineered by Fenn, the decision to send the dog to Callaway with Fenn embedded in the transport unit, Price doing an advance visit, the plan being, what? To have Coda euthanized here, probably, on behavioral grounds. Clean, clinical, documented. A working dog with a verified instability record, humanely ended at a respected facility. The detection record already reclassified, the dog gone, the last witness to what he'd found eliminated in a manner that generated paperwork instead of questions, except that Nora had been on shift. It almost worked, she said. Yeah, he exhaled. It almost worked. He was quiet for a moment. You said last night that Coda wasn't broken, that he was being controlled. I said it. You were right. He looked at her directly. And I was wrong. Not just about believing the reclassification, about how I handled him in the weeks before that. I was managing him like a piece of equipment that was malfunctioning, trying to correct the malfunction instead of understanding what it was telling me. He paused. I was trying to tell me something the whole time. He was. I didn't listen. You're listening now, she said. He absorbed that. It wasn't comfort, it was just fact. And she thought he probably wanted fact more than comfort, which was why she offered it. What happens to the investigation from here, he asked. That's not mine to know. She drank her coffee. I testified, I documented. Whatever DCIS does with it is their jurisdiction and their timeline. She set the cup down. What I know is that Fenn is in custody, Price is in custody, Veld is in custody, and Soto has a warrant out. The methodology is documented and in evidence. The 8 dog cases are in the official record. She paused. The 4 that were euthanized. That's in the record too. Harwick's jaw moved. There should be charges for that. There are. Animal cruelty under federal statute compounded by the intentional nature of the behavioral manipulation. Salter's team has been building that component separately. She looked at him. It won't bring them back. No, he said. It won't. They sat in the break room in the silence of people who were too tired to perform anything. Not comfort, not professional distance, just 2 people on the other side of something that had cost more than it should have. At 7:15, Salter called Nora into the conference room. The Washington team was still there, Breslin and her colleague, now with a third person added who hadn't been introduced, and who Nora suspected was recording the conversation. Salter was at the head of the table with the compact, deliberate posture of someone who had been on the phone with important people all day and was now about to say something that those calls had authorized. The investigation is being elevated, Salter said. Federal jurisdiction, full counterintelligence classification. What you've been part of today is now part of a much larger inquiry into the network Veld was operating in. She paused. Your testimony and documentation are the foundation of the behavioral evidence chain. We're going to need you available for ongoing consultation. I'll cooperate with whatever the investigation needs, Nora said. There's something else. Salter opened the folder in front of her. When we pulled the full records on Callaway as part of the Price advance visit documentation, we found something in the facility's internal communications from 3 months ago. She looked up. An email from the facility administration to the Military Veterinary Oversight Board, flagging a potential staffing concern. Specifically, a concern about a nurse on the overnight shift who was, quote, operating outside her designated clinical scope and demonstrating behavioral assessment competencies inconsistent with her stated qualifications. The room was quiet. The email was filed as an HR notation and not acted on, Salter continued. But it was in the system, and when Price ran his assessment of the facility, it was part of what he reviewed. She paused. He flagged you, Nora, 3 months ago. Whoever sent that email, we believe it was sent at Price's direction, as a preemptive measure in case you became an obstacle. Nora looked at the folder. Who sent it? Salter turned the folder so she could see the signature line. Dr. Marcus Tully. She looked at the name for a long moment. Not with anger. Anger would have been a simpler thing. with the particular understanding that came from having suspected something at a low level for a long time, and then having it confirmed in a way that made it retroactively clear. He didn't know why he was sending it, Salter said. We don't believe Tully was witting to the full operation. He was given a pretext, a concern about professional scope, and he acted on it because it fit what he already believed about you. She paused. But it's in the record. Yes, Nora said. It is. You'd have grounds for, I know what grounds I have. She kept her voice even. Let the investigation proceed. Tully's email is context for how the preemptive effort worked. It demonstrates that Price was running an operational assessment of potential obstacles 3 months in advance. She looked at Salter. That's more useful to you as evidence than anything I'd do with it personally. Breslin, who hadn't spoken since being introduced, said quietly, That's a measured response to learning that a colleague tried to undermine your professional standing. It's not measured, Nora said. It's practical. The measured response comes later. She looked at her hands. Right now the investigation needs everything positioned correctly. After that, she stopped. After that was a problem for a different version of tonight. There's one more thing, Salter said. Something in her tone made Nora look up. Salter set a second document on the table, a single page, dense with the specific formatting of formal military communication. She turned it so Nora could read it. It was an incident report filed at 0200 hours that morning, logged into the Military Veterinary Oversight System, time-stamped, credentialed, fully official. It was a formal complaint against Nora Vass for unauthorized interference in a military K-9 evaluation protocol, filed by, she read the author line twice, Colonel Wendell Price, filed 2 hours before he'd entered the building without proper authorization, before Coda alerted, before Decker stopped him in the conference room doorway. He had filed the complaint remotely, from his vehicle, on his way here. A preemptive strike designed to discredit her testimony and her clinical documentation before the situation inside Callaway played out, whatever way it played out. If he'd gotten what he came for, the complaint would have been the foundation for removing her from the evidence chain. If he hadn't, it was still in the system, still official, still carrying the signature of a colonel in Defense Intelligence. And it was still in the system now, even with Price in custody, because removing a filed military complaint required a specific authorization process that didn't happen automatically when the person who filed it got arrested. It can be challenged and overturned, Salter said. The process takes time, and during that time it technically remains on your professional record. Nora looked at the document. 22 hours ago, she had been counting suture kits in the supply room of a facility where nobody had looked at her clearance file since she was hired. She had been an overnight trauma nurse on the wrong end of a 14-hour shift. She had been unremarkable in the specific way that people become when the category they've been filed under is small enough that nobody feels the need to open the file again. And now her name was in a federal counterintelligence record. Her testimony was foundational to a case against a 2-star general and a contractor network, and there was a formal military complaint on her record filed by a man who had tried to have a dog killed to hide what the dog had found. How long does the challenge process take? She asked. Salter looked at Breslin. Breslin said, typically 60 to 90 days. Nora nodded. She folded her hands on the table. Outside the conference room window, the Callaway parking lot was lit in the pale late evening light, and there were more vehicles in it than there had been this morning, and 2 of them had federal plates she hadn't seen before. Then we start the challenge process tomorrow, she said. Tonight, I need to check on my patient. She stood up and left the conference room and walked back down the corridor toward the ward. The facility was quieter than it had been all day. The acute operational noise had settled into the lower hum of ongoing process, documentation, secure communications in closed rooms. The overnight shift would be starting in 45 minutes. Petra had extended through the evening to keep continuity, but the regular roster would be coming in. Nora pushed open the ward door. Coda raised his head when she came in. She sat down on the floor next to his kennel, and he crossed to the door and stood there, looking at her with the amber eyes that had been carrying 9 weeks of something nobody around him had understood. She looked back at him, and for a moment the full weight of the day, all 22 hours of it, from the suture kit count to the conference room to the name on the complaint, settled over her without the adrenaline buffer. She was tired in a way that went below muscle and bone. She put her hand through the kennel door, and Coda pressed his head against it, steady, present, doing the thing that dogs did that humans couldn't quite replicate, just being there, fully and without agenda. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Salter. A message, not a call. Soto not at Meridian office. Not at residence. Warrant served 1730. Location unknown. Travel records flagged. Update incoming. She stared at the message. Harlan Soto, the architect of the methodology, the man whose handwriting was on every piece of behavioral damage she'd documented today, had been warned. Someone in the network who hadn't been picked up yet had gotten word out in time for him to run. And Soto was the only person who knew the full scope of what the expanded protocol had been applied to. Not just the 8 dogs, not just the cases DCIS had identified. Everything, every application, every facility, every unit, every animal that had been systematically dismantled and discredited to hide something that someone needed hidden. He was the one thread that could unravel everything that was still unknown. And he was gone. Soto had 11 hours. That was what the travel record showed when DCIS finished pulling them. 11 hours between the moment Price had been stopped in the Callaway conference room and the moment the warrant team arrived at Meridian's research division office to find Soto's desk cleared and his workstation wiped. Someone had made a call, not Price. His phones had been confiscated, but someone adjacent to Price, someone in the outer ring of the network who hadn't been identified yet, and who had understood what Price's silence meant. 11 hours was enough time to drive to 3 different states. It was enough time to reach an airport that wasn't flagged yet, or a border crossing on a secondary route, or a safe house that existed in no database DCIS had access to. Nora read the update sitting on the ward floor with Coda's head against her hand, and then she put the phone away and sat with the fact of it. The methodology man. The one who knew everything. Gone. She wasn't going to pretend it didn't matter. It mattered the way a missing piece mattered. Not catastrophically, because the case existed without Soto. The evidence was documented, and the arrests were real, and Price and Veld were in custody with more than enough to hold them. But Soto was the connective tissue. He was the one who could answer the questions that the documents only implied. How many applications? How many animals? What else had been buried under the cover of behavioral instability? And who beyond Veld's network had commissioned it? Those questions didn't disappear just because Soto had. She was still in the ward when Harwick came to find her at 8:45. He stood in the doorway the same way he'd stood the first time, reading the room before entering, and then came in and sat on the floor across from her, back against the opposite wall, close enough to talk without raising his voice. Salter told me about Soto, he said. I know. Does it compromise the case against Veld? No, Veld's contacts are on Price's phone. The surveillance device reclassifications are in the official military record with Veld's signature. The behavioral files on the 8 dogs are documented and evidenced. She looked at Coda, who had settled back into his lying down position, but with his head still up. What Soto's disappearance compromises is the completeness of what we know. There may be cases we haven't identified, animals we haven't found. Harwick absorbed that. DCIS will keep looking. Yes, she said, they will. A silence settled that wasn't uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that came between people who had been through something together and didn't need to fill every pause. You should go home, he said. I know. You've been here for 23 hours, she said. I know that too. He looked at her. What's keeping you? She didn't answer immediately. What was keeping her was something she couldn't quite articulate in a way that would sound rational to someone who hadn't spent the last 2 decades watching what happened when animals in distress were left without a consistent, known presence. She could explain the clinical rationale. Coda's sensitization meant that changes in his environment needed to be gradual and predictable, that the ward staffing transition from her to an overnight tech represented exactly the kind of variable that could reverse the modest stabilization he'd achieved today. She could say all of that. What she said instead was, he had a plan tonight. When that man walked into the conference room, he knew. Harwick looked at Coda. Yeah. They built him to work. The certification, the training, the deployment, all of it was designed to make him useful to people. And what he did tonight was exactly that. She paused. He just found the person who needed it, instead of waiting to be pointed. Harwick was quiet for a while. Then, he chose you. He chose who was paying attention. She looked up. That's different from being chosen. It just means I was watching. What? She went home at 9:30. Not because she stopped worrying. She didn't, not really. The particular frequency of concern that she'd been operating on for 23 hours didn't simply switch off, but because staying had crossed from clinically useful into something that was about her own state of mind more than Coda's welfare, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize the difference. The overnight tech who came in, a young man named Ellis, who had been at Callaway for 8 months and who had none of Tully's institutional defensiveness and a genuine patience with animals that showed in the way he moved through the ward, she briefed him for 20 minutes with full written instructions, then let it go. She slept for 9 hours, which was more than she expected. The next 3 weeks had a different texture than the night that preceded them. Not easier, exactly. Easier wasn't the right word for a period that included 2 formal federal interviews, a military review board that required her to reconstruct her Farview program timeline in precise detail, and the ongoing clinical work of managing Coda's rehabilitation from a baseline of physiological sensitization that didn't respond to shortcuts. But it was a different kind of difficulty. The acute danger was gone. What remained was process, which was slower and less dramatic and required a different kind of endurance. The complaint Price had filed was formally challenged on day 3. The challenge was supported by Salter's documentation, by the evidence record, and by a letter from the DCIS director's office that Breslin had arranged without being asked. The review board that assessed the complaint took 11 days, which was fast by the standards of such things. On day 12, it was expunged from Nora's professional record entirely, not suspended, not noted, expunged, with a formal notation that the complaint had been filed in bad faith as part of a documented criminal operation. She found out via email. She read it twice, then set her phone face down on the nursing station counter and went to do her 9 o'clock check on Coda. The Tully situation was more complicated in the specific way that situations involving people who had done something wrong without fully understanding what they were part of tended to be. The administrative review found that he had sent the email at what he believed to be the legitimate request of a visiting official, Price, during his advance visit 3 months earlier, presented as a routine military oversight consultant. Tully had believed he was flagging a genuine staffing concern through proper channels. He had also, the review found, allowed his existing professional skepticism of Nora to make him receptive to a suggestion that confirmed what he'd already decided about her. That wasn't criminal. It was something more ordinary and more corrosive, so the kind of bias that dressed itself up as professional judgment. His administrative leave was extended pending a full review of his clinical practices at Callaway. Whether he returned to his role in any capacity was a determination that wouldn't be made for months. Nora didn't involve herself in that process. It wasn't her call, and spending energy on it wasn't going to help the 3 dogs in external facilities whose rehabilitation plans she was co-developing remotely, or the case documentation she was still refining, or the animal in Kennel 4 who had earned more of her focused attention than almost anything else. Coda's progress was not linear. She had told Harwick it wouldn't be, but knowing that intellectually and watching it in practice were different things. There were days when he was responsive and present and showed clear signs of the operational animal underneath the damage. The focused alertness, the precision of his attention, the way he moved through a space like he was reading it. And there were days when a noise from the parking lot or an unfamiliar staff member in the ward would trip the sensitized startle response, and he'd cycle back into the tight, braced anxiety that had been his whole visible personality when he arrived. The bad days required patience rather than intervention, which was the hardest thing to explain to people who were trained to do something when an animal was in distress. Doing less, doing slower, sitting on the floor and waiting. These didn't look like treatment, they looked like inaction. But the sensitization had been built through repeated force stimulus, which meant the nervous system's recovery required the experience of stimulus that didn't escalate, expectation that wasn't punished, trust extended before it was earned and held open long enough for the animal to test whether it was real. Real was the operative word. You couldn't fake your way through it with a working dog at this level. They had been trained to read humans with a precision that made most human-to-human interaction look approximate by comparison. If you were impatient underneath the stillness, they knew. If your calm was a performance, they knew. The work required that you actually be the thing you were presenting, which meant that in some ways rehabilitating Coda also required Nora to be more honest with herself about her own states than she was naturally inclined to be. She was not by nature a patient person. She was a careful person, a thorough person, a person who could perform patience very convincingly. But real patience, the kind that didn't have an agenda underneath it, was something she had to actively build toward on the difficult days. Harwick visited twice a week. She had established clear parameters for this. He came during the late morning, when the ward was quietest, stayed for no more than 90 minutes, and followed the handling protocols she'd written without deviation. He was better at this than she'd expected. The handlers she'd worked with in the Farview adjacent programs had often struggled with the trust-based approach because it read to them as a loss of control, and control was what their operational work depended on. Harwick had a different relationship with it. He seemed to understand, in a way she hadn't fully expected, that letting Coda set the pace wasn't weakness. It was information. The dog telling him, in the only language available, what was safe and what wasn't. And Harwick was listening this time. Soto was found on day 19. Not by DCIS, by a customs flag at a small regional crossing in northern Idaho, 40 miles from the Canadian border. He'd spent 18 days moving laterally through secondary locations, which suggested he'd had a plan, and the plan had mostly worked until it didn't. The customs flag was triggered by a biometric match from a secondary database, the kind of match that only registered because someone at DCIS had thought to push Soto's information to every border-adjacent agency within a 7-state radius on day 1. He was taken into federal custody at 6:14 in the morning. By afternoon, he had a federal attorney and had communicated through that attorney that he intended to cooperate fully in exchange for sentencing consideration. Nora learned about it from Salter, who called rather than texted, which told her something about the significance before Salter said a word. "He's talking," Salter said. He identified 4 additional cases beyond the 8 we had. 2 dogs, one in Arizona, one at a training facility in Virginia, are alive and in programs we can now reassess with your framework. 2 others were euthanized before we would have found them without his information. 2 more that could be helped. 2 more that couldn't. "The Virginia dog," Nora said. "What's his current treatment status?" "Standard behavioral rehabilitation. The program there is using graduated exposure methods." "I need those records, today if possible." "I'll have them to you by end of day." A pause. Soto also confirmed the full scope of the Veld operation, 14 months of active surveillance, 3 installations. The intelligence was being routed through a shell company registered in a country that we're now working through diplomatic channels to access. Another pause. He confirmed that the behavioral program was designed specifically to neutralize detection capability. His words were that the dogs were the only security system that couldn't be bypassed technically. She sat with that for a moment. The only system that couldn't be bypassed technically, so they'd bypassed it behaviorally. They'd gone after the trust the dogs had built with their handlers, the credibility of their alerts, the relationships that made the dog's communication meaningful. It was a specific kind of cruelty, one that understood what it was destroying well enough to target it precisely. "Charges?" she asked. "Veld is facing espionage statutes, conspiracy, obstruction. Price? Conspiracy and obstruction with the additional federal charge for the unauthorized access attempt on your personnel file. Fen, animal cruelty under federal statute, criminal conspiracy, illegal modification of classified military equipment." Salter paused. Soto's charges depend on his cooperation, but his attorneys have been told that the animal cruelty component is non-negotiable, regardless of what else he offers. "Good," Nora said. "There's one more thing." Salter's voice shifted slightly. Something that wasn't quite formality and wasn't quite the opposite. "The Military Veterinary Oversight Board is convening a formal review of the K9 behavioral assessment standards in response to this case. They've requested that you provide expert testimony and consulting input into the revised protocol framework." A pause. "It's not mandatory, but they asked specifically for you." Nora looked out the window of the break room. The parking lot was ordinary in the early afternoon light. No federal vehicles, no DCIS SUVs, just the regular staff cars in the ambulance bay and the late October sky sitting flat and pale over Teller, Idaho, going about its business. "Tell them yes," she said. The formal review board convened 4 weeks later in a government building in Boise that smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. There were 11 people at the table when Nora walked in, military officers, veterinary officials, two representatives from the oversight committee that had replaced the compromised structure Veld had operated inside, and one person from the DCIS investigative team. Salter was there, in the back row, not at the table. Nora had testified before rooms like this before. Not this specific kind. The Farview departure had involved a much smaller and quieter exit, but she understood the structure of formal review, the way language mattered in it, the way precision and credibility reinforced each other or didn't. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes. She described the clinical indicators of induced behavioral deterioration, the differentiation from genuine operational stress response, the rehabilitation framework she'd developed, and the case outcomes for the animals under her care. She described what the Farview expanded protocols had been, why she had objected to them, and how recognizing their application in CODA had been the pivot point of the entire investigation. Then she said something that wasn't in any clinical documentation. The dogs in this program are asked to work at the edge of what their biology makes possible, she said. They detect things humans can't. They hold steady in conditions that would break human concentration. They make decisions in the field that their handlers stake lives on. We ask all of that because they're capable of it. She looked at the people at the table. What we owe them in return is not comfort. Working dogs don't want comfort. They want purpose. What we owe them is accuracy, the ability to say what they're saying and be believed. The same credibility we'd extend to any other specialized system we'd stake a mission on. She paused. What happened to these 8 dogs? And the 2 additional cases we've now identified was the deliberate destruction of that credibility. It was targeted because someone understood that the most effective way to neutralize a detection system was to make its outputs unreliable in the eyes of the people receiving them. She looked down at her hands, then back up. The lesson isn't that we need better technology or better protocols. The lesson is that the relationship between a working dog and the people responsible for him is itself a security asset. And like any asset, it requires protection, maintenance, and the basic respect of being taken seriously. The room was quiet for a moment after she finished. The board chair, a colonel named Fenwick, who had said almost nothing during the session, looked at her with an expression she couldn't easily categorize. Ms. Vass, he said, your resignation from the Farview program. The formal objection you filed at the time is part of our record. He paused. Had that objection been acted on rather than filed and set aside, it's plausible that the methodology you objected to would not have been available for the use it was put to. That's plausible, she said. Do you want to speak to that? She thought about it for a moment. I wrote the objection because it was what the situation required. I left when the objection was disregarded because staying would have meant continuing to work inside something I'd formally identified as wrong, and I wasn't willing to do that. She kept her voice even. I don't know what would have happened if the objection had been acted on. I know what happened because it wasn't. Those are 2 different questions. Fenwick nodded slowly. The board will be recommending your formal reinstatement to military veterinary consulting status, with the designation of subject matter expert in behavioral trauma and working dog rehabilitation. He paused. If that's something you want. I want to finish what I'm currently doing, she said. After that, yes. The Callaway Military Animal Medical Center looked different in December than it had in October. Less leaf cover on the trees at the property edge, the sky lower and grayer, the parking lot often slick with the first ice of the season that the maintenance team never quite got ahead of. But the ward smelled the same, antiseptic and animal, the familiar composite of the place where Nora had spent 11 months being unremarkable. She was not unremarkable anymore, which she was still adjusting to. The staff dynamic had shifted in ways both small and significant. Petra had promoted her informally, simply by routing clinical questions and case concerns in her direction as a matter of course, which was a form of recognition that mattered more than titles. The overnight team, Ellis and the 2 others who held down the late shifts, had reorganized their working relationship with her around what she actually knew rather than what her official designation had said. Even Osh had changed. He was more careful now, more thorough in the questions he asked before categorizing anything or anyone. She didn't know if that would last, but she'd seen it hold for 6 weeks, which was longer than she'd expected. Tully did not return. The review of his clinical practices found several additional instances of protocol decisions that had prioritized his own framework over better evidenced approaches. and the facility had opted for a quiet separation that suited everyone. She didn't know where he'd gone and hadn't asked. The two dogs in external facilities, the one in Arizona, named Quill, and the Virginia dog named Saber, were both reassessed using her framework within 2 weeks of Soto's cooperation confirmation. Quill's results indicated a moderate sensitization profile, recoverable with the right approach. Saber's were more serious, a longer exposure period, more aggressive application, a physiological signature that suggested the protocol had been run at higher intensity. She co-developed both rehabilitation plans with the facility's clinical teams, conducting weekly remote consultations that were logged and documented as part of the broader case record. Quill's handler was a young woman named Torres, who had spent 3 months being told that her dog's behavioral deterioration was a reflection of her own inadequate handling, that she needed to correct more firmly, establish clearer dominance, rebuild the hierarchy that was supposedly breaking down. Torres had believed this partly because there's a specific kind of institutional pressure that makes people doubt their own accurate perceptions when the doubt is coming from someone with more rank or more credentials. When Nora talked to Torres for the first time over a secure video call, the woman looked exhausted in the specific way of someone who'd been carrying blame that wasn't theirs. "He was trying to tell you," Nora said, "the whole time. He just didn't have a language you were being allowed to hear." Torres had been quiet for a moment. Then, "I knew something was wrong. I kept saying something was wrong." "I know," Nora said. "The record shows it." That mattered to Torres in a way that was visible even through a screen, and Nora understood it. Having the record show it, having the institutional documentation confirm what your own perception had been telling you, was a different thing from simply being believed. It was vindication with evidence. It was the system, slowly and imperfectly, catching up to what one person with direct knowledge had been saying. Coda cleared his first major rehabilitation milestone on a Tuesday in late November, 6.5 weeks after he'd arrived in Callaway's intake bay at 11:47 p.m. and terrified everyone in the building. The milestone wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a scene. It was Harwick walking into the ward for his regular visit, and Coda getting to his feet before the door had fully opened, crossing to the kennel door, and making a sound that wasn't a bark and wasn't a vocalization of distress. It was something lower and more particular, the sound of a dog recognizing something and saying so. Harwick crouched at the kennel door, and Coda pressed his whole face against it, and the tail that had been offering 2 brief movements since the beginning was moving fully now, the full body shift of a large dog that had decided something. Nora was at the ward entrance. She watched it and wrote nothing in her notepad for a full minute, which for her was the equivalent of stopping in the middle of a sentence. Harwick looked over his shoulder at her. His face was doing something it hadn't done in the entire time she'd known him, which was let a feeling show without the architecture of command discipline holding it in shape. Just a man looking at his dog choosing him again after 9 weeks of someone else's cruelty, and not having a word for it that was the right size. She didn't try to provide one. What she did, over the following 2 weeks, was begin the graduated in-person handling sessions. Harwick inside the kennel space rather than outside it, first for 5 minutes, then 10. Building the vocabulary of their physical relationship back up from the baseline of what Coda was willing to offer each day. There were sessions that went well and sessions that didn't. There was a day in early December when an equipment noise from the adjacent storage room triggered a full acute response and set them back 3 days of progress. There was a day that same week when Coda picked up an object Harwick had dropped and held it, and that uncomplicated act, the retrieval instinct, the object in the dog's mouth, the presentation back to the handler, made Harwick clear his throat and look at the ceiling for a moment before he said anything. "He still has it," Harwick said. "He always had it," Nora said. "It was never gone, just buried." The charges moved through the system on the timeline that federal charges moved, which was not fast. Fenn's plea agreement was finalized first, criminal conspiracy, illegal modification of military equipment, and 4 federal counts of aggravated animal cruelty, each carrying a significant sentencing range. He cooperated in exchange for a reduced range and remained in federal custody pending sentencing. Price went to trial rather than pleading, which extended his timeline and generated a volume of public record documentation about the operation that Nora read through on 2 separate evenings with the same methodical attention she'd given Meridian's files in the conference room 2 months earlier. Veld's case was the most complex because espionage charges carried the most layers. His attorneys filed 4 separate motions in the first 6 weeks, all of which were denied. The evidence from Price's phone, the surveillance reclassification records, Soto's full cooperation testimony, and the signals intelligence recovered from the shell company's records constituted a chain that his defense team was unable to find a weakness in. His trial date was set for the following spring. Soto received the most complicated outcome. His cooperation had been genuine, and his information had led to the identification of the 2 additional cases and the recovery of the shell company records, which were significant contributions. He received a reduced charge structure that still included federal animal cruelty counts, because the board's position, and Nora's in her testimony, was that the behavioral manipulation of the dogs was not a peripheral element of what had happened. It was the core mechanism. It deserved to be named in the charges and to carry weight in the sentencing. His attorneys had argued that the dogs were essentially equipment. The board had disagreed, formally and in writing, which itself went into the federal record as a precedent notation. The review board's revised protocol framework was published in mid-December, a 47-page document that incorporated Nora's assessment methodology, her rehabilitation framework, and a new set of standards for behavioral evaluation of working dogs that specifically addressed the detection of induced deterioration versus genuine operational stress response. It was distributed to every military K-9 unit in the country, with a mandate for implementation by the following spring. Her name was on it, not in the acknowledgments, not in a footnote. In the authorship line, first position, the standard place for the person who did the primary work. She read that line once, in the break room at Callaway, during an ordinary Tuesday overnight shift. Then she set the document down, finished her coffee, and went to do rounds. The ceremony, in the end, was Osh's idea, which surprised her. He came to her in early December and said, with the directness that had emerged in him since October as a kind of corrective to his previous habit of managing rather than communicating, the facility should formally acknowledge what happened, not the investigation. That's not ours to make a ceremony of, but the clinical work, the rehabilitation program, the framework. He paused. And you? That's not necessary, she said. I know it's not necessary, he said. It's appropriate, which is different. She thought about declining. She thought about it for approximately 12 seconds, and then she thought about Torres, who was still rebuilding her own confidence 3 states away. She thought about the 4 dogs that couldn't be in any ceremony because they were gone. She thought about the fact that the 2 dead dogs and the 2 euthanized ones had never been acknowledged anywhere in the official record under their own names. They appeared in documentation as case numbers, as file references, as evidentiary entries. She thought about the fact that appropriate was different from necessary, and that sometimes the appropriate thing mattered in ways that operated on a different timeline than the useful thing. Make it small, she said, and include the 3 surviving dogs in the record, not as cases, by name. Osh nodded. Done. It was small. 14 people, the Callaway staff, Salter, Harwick, Breslin, Torres, on a video screen set up in the corner of the main meeting room, and 2 members of the oversight board who came from Boise. No press, no formal statement, no occasion for anyone to give a speech about what a remarkable sequence of events it had been. What there was, a framed copy of the protocol framework mounted on the wall outside the rehabilitation ward with a brass plate beneath it that listed all 5 of the named animals in the investigation, Coda, Quill, Saber, and below those the 2 who hadn't made it, Talus and Wren, both named and dated. No euphemisms. No institutional softening. Their names and the dates they'd been euthanized, and below both a line that read, "They were not broken. They were silenced." This framework exists so that silence ends here. Nora had written that line. She'd written it 3 times, thrown out the first 2 drafts, and landed on those words because they were exact without being theatrical, and exact was what the situation required. Coda was in the room. Harwick had brought him on a standard lead, no tactical harness, and the dog moved through the space with the alert, orienting attention of a working animal reassessing an environment, checking it, cataloging it, deciding what it meant. He greeted 3 of the staff by putting his nose briefly to their hands, which was more social engagement than he'd shown with anyone outside of Nora and Harwick in the past 2 months. He stopped in front of the monitor showing Torres and tilted his head at the screen, and Torres laughed, the first time Nora had heard her laugh, and said through the speaker, "Quill does that too. They all do. They watch screens like they're windows." "They are a little," Nora said. "They're reading what's behind them." Harwick stood beside Nora for most of the brief ceremony with Coda at his left. At one point, not during any formal moment, just while someone else was speaking, he said quietly, without looking at her, "He's been cleared for a preliminary operational assessment, not deployment, just assessment." She looked at Coda, who was sitting with his head up, watching the room with the amber-eyed precision that had been his from the beginning. "When?" "After the new year, if he's ready." "He'll tell you," she said. "I know," Harwick said. "I'm going to listen this time." She believed him completely, which was not something she said lightly about anyone. After the ceremony, if it could be called that, 14 people in a meeting room and a dog who kept trying to investigate the potted plant near the window, most of the staff drifted back to the ward and the work that didn't pause for occasions. Salter said goodbye with a handshake and a look that communicated more than the handshake, and Breslin left with the quiet efficiency of someone who had more appointments than ours. Torres signed off from the video screen with the specific expression of someone who was going to be okay. Not because everything was fixed, but because the narrative of what had been corrected at the level that mattered. Officially, formally, in writing. Nora ended up at the brass plate outside the rehabilitation ward. She stood in front of it for a moment. Coda appeared at her left side. Harwick had let him off the lead while they were in the ward space, a small trust, and sat down next to her with his shoulder against her leg, both of them looking at the 5 names on the plate. She thought about the suture kit count, about midnight and a pager going off, about sitting down on a concrete floor in front of a dog that had been made to seem dangerous because the only other option was to understand him, and understanding him was too inconvenient for the people who needed him to be a problem. She thought about what it had cost to stay quiet about what she was. The years in an overnight role that nobody looked at, watching people like Tully make decisions that were wrong with the full confidence of institutional authority. She had told herself it was strategic, that the latitude of being overlooked was worth the cost of being overlooked. That was partly true, but it was also true that she had been afraid. Not of confrontation, not of being wrong, afraid of being back inside something like Farview, something institutional and military, and capable of generating enormous momentum in a direction that one person's formal objection couldn't redirect. She had left that world and found a corner of a different one and stayed small in it. And then a dog had walked into a room, and the situation had required something other than small. That was the thing about the situations that mattered. They didn't ask if you were ready. They didn't check whether you'd decided to re-engage or whether you were still committed to staying quiet. They just arrived. And what you did in the first few seconds was everything, because the few seconds after that depended entirely on what you'd already chosen. She had sat down on the floor. She had waited. She had told the truth about what she saw, as precisely as she could, to everyone who needed to hear it, regardless of whether they outranked her, or had more credentials, or had decided before she opened her mouth that she wasn't worth listening to. That was the whole of it. That was everything she'd done. And it had been enough. Not because she was exceptional, not because the system eventually worked the way it should, not because good people always prevailed or justice was guaranteed or any of the clean, uncomplicated things that stories about situations like this were supposed to teach. It had been enough because she had not talked herself out of doing it. She had seen a dog that was suffering, and she had not convinced herself that she was the wrong person to say so. She had seen a device that shouldn't have existed, and she had not waited for someone with more authority to notice it first. She had written an objection 5 years ago in a program that nobody acted on, and she had not let that outcome become her reason to stop writing objections. Most of the things that mattered came down to that, in the end. Not the size of the act, not the credentials behind the person doing it. Whether the person doing it decided that what they were seeing was real, and that saying so, clearly, precisely, regardless of the response, was the only available option. Coda's weight shifted against her leg. She looked down at him, and he looked up at her with the amber eyes that had been watching everything from the beginning, and she put her hand on his head the way she had on the cold floor of the evaluation room at 1 a.m. when he'd been 110 pounds of manufactured terror that turned out to be something else entirely, something that had only needed one person to see it correctly. She was not going to pretend that the world had become simpler. Soto's information had opened questions that would take years to fully answer. The espionage investigation extended into networks that DCIS was still mapping. There were probably animals and handlers she would never know about who had been caught in the same mechanism and hadn't had the same threat of luck. An overnight nurse who happened to have seen an EMTAC-6 receiver before, who happened to be standing in the intake bay when the door opened, who happened to sit down on the floor instead of backing away. Luck was part of it. She was honest enough to know that. But luck without someone willing to act on what they saw was just luck. And she had been willing. That part was hers. Kota stood up, shook himself once, the full-body shake of a dog concluding one thing and preparing for the next, and looked toward the ward, where Ellis was starting the evening rounds and the sounds of the overnight world were beginning their familiar accumulation. "All right," she said. She followed him in.